On the morning of July 26, 1184, around 60 noblemen climbed the stairs of a building in Erfurt, Germany, to attend a meeting with consequences for the entire Holy Roman Empire. Two powerful men, a landgrave and an archbishop, had been locked in a bitter feud over control of the city, and the future emperor, Henry VI, had personally traveled there to force a resolution. Counts, lords, and church officials packed into the upper floor of the hall, all gathered around the two men they were there to reconcile. Nobody in that room was thinking about the building's foundations. They had no reason to. But the wooden floor beneath them was old, and the beams holding it up had quietly rotted for years. And directly underneath the entire assembly sat the structure's cesspit, years of accumulated human waste from everyone who had ever used the building's latrines. The floor gave way. Then the floor beneath that gave way too. Around 60 nobles fell straight through 2 stories and into the pit below, where most of them drowned in the waste they landed in. Henry VI and the archbishop survived purely by accident. They happened to be seated together in a stone window alcove when the collapse began, and they clung to the ledge until rescuers arrived with ladders to pull them out. Had the future emperor fallen with the rest of the room, a meaningful stretch of European political history might have unfolded completely differently, over something as mundane as where a building chose to put its toilet. That disaster sounds almost too absurd to be a real historical event. It happened, and it's documented well enough that historians still debate the exact death count today, somewhere between 60 and 100. But it's also a useful doorway into a part of medieval life that almost nobody takes seriously: how an entire continent, for roughly 1,000 years, managed one of the most basic and unavoidable human problems without anything resembling modern plumbing. Start with the people who had it relatively good. In castles, the wealthy used something called a garderobe, a small stone chamber built directly into the outer wall, fitted with a wooden bench and a hole that dropped straight down a shaft into the moat, a river, or a pit at the base of the tower. The word itself is French for to guard one's robes, and that name points to something genuinely strange. Residents would hang their clothing inside the shaft on purpose, using the ammonia fumes rising from the waste below as a crude but effective way to kill lice and fleas living in the fabric. This wasn't a hole someone dug in a hurry. It was a designed piece of architecture with a second function deliberately built on top of the first. Designed didn't mean safe. The same narrow shaft that made garderobes practical also created a real security weakness. During sieges, soldiers occasionally tried to climb up through them to get inside a castle undetected, which meant builders had to think about toilets as a potential point of attack, not just a sanitation problem. And the structures themselves could fail with time, the same way any wooden floor or stone ledge eventually does. Erfurt wasn't a freak, isolated event. It was simply the worst possible outcome of a risk that existed anywhere a heavy wooden floor sat above a deep, unchecked pit of waste for years on end. Someone had to maintain these pits before they reached that kind of danger, and that job fell to a specific class of laborer known in England as Gong Farmers. Their work was exactly what it sounds like: climbing down into cesspits and physically removing the waste by hand, using buckets, baskets, and simple tools, then hauling it out of the city or town entirely. They did this almost exclusively at night, generally sometime between 9 in the evening and 5 in the morning, specifically timed so the smell wouldn't disturb anyone while the work happened. In some towns, Gong farmers were required to live in designated areas on the outskirts, partly for public health reasons, and partly because their trade carried a heavy social stigma that followed them even outside of working hours. The job paid relatively well by the standards of unskilled medieval labor, and it occasionally paid even better than expected. Gong farmers were known to search through what they collected for rings, coins, and other valuables that had slipped out of pockets and into the pit. An unpleasant but genuinely lucrative side benefit of the work. It was also dangerous in ways that went beyond disease. Records describe a Gong farmer named Richard the Raker, who died in the 1320s after falling into a cesspit while working in London. A small, almost forgotten case, but a real one, and a sobering reminder that Erfurt's disaster was an extreme version of an ordinary occupational hazard, not something unique to it. That entire system, garderobes and Gong Farmers together, mostly served nobility and castles. For ordinary people living in towns, daily sanitation looked completely different, and in some ways more communal. Most common households had no private toilet of any kind. People kept portable chamber pots inside the home for nighttime use. And in larger cities like medieval London, public latrines, sometimes recorded in old documents as sedge houses, existed specifically because private toilets simply weren't realistic for the majority of the population. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of one London latrine, built with 2 long rows of seating, 64 seats to a row. It was nothing like a private modern bathroom, but it was a genuinely functional piece of civic infrastructure that an ordinary city resident could actually count on using. A system used by that many people couldn't run on goodwill alone, and medieval cities knew it. 13th century London building regulations pushed homeowners toward stone-lined cesspits instead of bare earth pits, specifically to cut down on waste leaking into the ground and into neighboring properties. The rules even specified minimum distances. A stone-lined cesspit had to sit at least 2.5 feet from a neighbor's land, with a full extra foot required if the pit wasn't lined in stone. None of this was bureaucratic decoration. Leaking or overflowing cesspits created genuine legal disputes between neighbors, and city governments were actively managing sanitation complaints centuries before anyone had any concept of germs or bacteria. Some of the most advanced sanitation in medieval Europe wasn't found in castles or cities at all, but in monasteries. Large abbeys often had the resources, the manpower, and the long-term planning that individual households simply didn't. And some built dedicated drainage channels that used flowing water from a nearby stream or diverted rainwater to carry waste away continuously, rather than letting it sit and accumulate in a single pit. It's a small detail, but it says something real about where engineering knowledge actually concentrated in this period. It wasn't necessarily wealth that produced the best sanitation. It was whichever institution had the stability and the long planning horizon to build infrastructure meant to outlast a single generation. What absolutely nobody had, regardless of how wealthy they were, was anything resembling toilet paper. Moss, hay, grass, and rags handled that job across most of medieval Europe, available to nobles and peasants alike, since money couldn't buy a product that simply didn't exist yet. The Islamic world during the same centuries generally practiced a more advanced hygiene routine built around water and regular hand washing, a real and well-documented difference in daily practice between regions living through the exact same period of history. None of this evidence suggests medieval sanitation was secretly sophisticated by modern standards, and none of it supports the opposite myth either, that medieval life was uniformly filthy and chaotic. What actually existed was a working system shaped entirely by its limitations. No running water, no germ theory, but real engineering, real legal regulation, and a specific, identifiable, occasionally well-paid profession built around a problem every single person on the planet shares, every single day, in every century. That's the part most retellings miss when they reduce this whole subject to a joke about peasants squatting in a field. The reality looked more like an unglamorous but genuinely functioning piece of urban and architectural infrastructure, staffed by skilled, stigmatized workers, governed by real legal codes, full of real engineering trade-offs, and prone to catastrophic failure in the worst way physically possible. And on one July morning in 1184, it came close enough to swallowing a future Holy Roman Emperor that European history nearly had to find a different ending altogether.